Welcome to the Counseling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counseling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How you doing, Ken?
Exceptionally well. Thanks for asking, Rory. So grateful to be here. You have joined us for episode 214 of the Counseling Tutor Podcast. Today, we are going to be having three different topics, starting off with our counseling foundations, where we revisit one of the important stones that form the foundations of a counseling practice. And today, we're looking at the skill of questioning, something that I see misused again and again. And I'm going to actually put an extra word in there, the skill of appropriate questioning. I'm going to put in, Rory.
Yes.
And then we go on to focus on self, where we recognize that you are the heart that beats within the center of your practice. In order for us to be there for our clients in our practice, we need to look after ourselves. And today we're going to be speaking about leaving client material behind. When the client leaves the room, is there something that sticks with us that we take into our own lives? And then we go into practice matters, where we dip our toe into what we may come across in our practice, in the professional day-to-day running of a counseling practice. And that can be a client presentation or something regarding how we run our practice. And today, I think really interesting, we're looking at social media etiquette. What are we leaving behind in terms of a footprint on social media? How are we conducting ourselves on social media? Even if it's in our private life, can it come on and kind of influence our practice in some way? And Rory, you met up with James Taylor, who did a lecture for us on this topic, and we're going to be diving into that. But we start off with those very important foundations, where today we're looking at the skill of questioning. Can I ask you a question, Rory?
Go ahead.
What do you know about the skill of questioning?
Why do you ask?
Notice all the questions going backwards and forwards.
Yes. Well, I think it's interesting, and I'd like to pick up what you said at the top of the piece about it being appropriate questioning. You know, we both talk, Ken, and we both have very fond memories, maybe at level 2, of watching, foundation students, new students, use questioning. And sometimes it looks more like a police interview than it does a counselling session. And the key thing here is appropriate. And I think what I'd also observe is that different modalities of therapy have different questioning strategies. So in person-centered therapy, it's generally accepted. And there may be people who have differing opinions on this, so I'll acknowledge this. But we only use questions to clarify our understanding. In other words, when we're not sure of what a client is saying, so for instance, someone might say, well, she said that, and you may say, I hear you say she said that, but I just wonder who she is so I could understand that. It's to clarify it so that you're in pace, you're in step with the client, as opposed to using something maybe called Socratic questioning, where you're asking the client questions to readjust their thinking. And I think it's a bit of a skill, because I guess in our society, we are used to questioning in everyday life, aren't we, Kim?
We are. It is an interesting one here. And I think as many therapists as there are that many ways of looking at how appropriate questions are used. So I think that, and I'm going to speak from a person-centered perspective here. You know, you mentioned, Rory, that questions are only used within person-centered therapy to, I guess, align our frame of reference. So the whole concept here is that in person-centered therapy, you kind of going to step in as best you can to the client's frame of reference and see through their eyes what they're experiencing it, and then communicate that back. And it's only when we kind of become misaligned that we might ask a question to realign ourselves. But I still think, even with that definition, it is misused and misunderstood often. And I'm talking about from my perspective of how I view them. So I'll give you an example. You mentioned at the top, Rory, and then she said, so it may be a conversation. I went to the market with my mum and my sister, And then she really made me angry because she said blah, blah, blah. Well, who made you angry? The mum or the sister? So you may then go in and say, I hear you say that she made you really angry. In this context, who is the she? And then my mother made me really angry. Oh, okay, now my frame of reference is aligned with you. I know we're talking about the mother. Yes. So there, I guess it kind of makes sense. But there's another area. And again, it's about us clarifying our perception. Maybe the client would make a noise. Maybe we'd say something and the client would go, oh. We can ask a question about that to clarify our understanding, because what does oh mean? So you might step in and say, now I hear when you're making that kind of sighing noise, something might be coming up for you. I wonder what that might be. That's a question. But it's a question that aligns you with the frame of reference of the client because they brought it in. And I think where it becomes inappropriate in person-centered therapy from the model itself is when we are satisfying our own need or want to know something. So I went to the market with my mum and my sister, and she made me really angry. And it was my mum who made me really angry. That's interesting you say that. How have you been getting on with your mum lately?
Yes.
Is an inappropriate question because it's not from the frame of reference of that person, even though it may be in context. It's me wanting to know that bit of info.
Yes, and I think that brings us to the element that we've always discussed when we train together, Ken. Who is the question for?
Yep.
Is it for you to be able to better understand the client's frame of reference, better understand, the direction that they're looking at, if you want to use a more visual cue, or is it to satisfy our own curiosity? And if it's to satisfy our own curiosity, we're going down the rabbit hole of kind of entertaining ourselves, I think. Client work is not, is not a soap opera or, a kind of tabloid headline. And I think sometimes we can be faced with clients whose stories you probably wouldn't even hear on a soap opera because they are so difficult, so complicated. And sometimes, I've heard stories and I've said to my supervisor, I just don't believe that kind of thing happens. I'm not disbelieving the client, but it's just so new to me. And I think that when you become overly curious in the service of yourself, then what you're really doing is you're using the client to entertain you and to educate you. And I don't think that's what therapy is for. Therapy is about being the best for your client, being able to facilitate the client and in the direction they want. But you make a very good point. We should only use questions to clarify our frame of reference and understand where the client's coming from.
From a person-centered model. And of course, if you, as you mentioned at the top of this, Rory, if you're working with a different model, there may be a requirement to ask questions. If you're working with CBT, for instance, you're going to be asking probing questions to understand and to get the person to think and describe what's going on for them. So it is model specific. And I look back to my time when I worked in drugs and alcohol, and when doing work in drugs and alcohol, certainly with the modality that I was practicing at that time, there were directive informing questions where I, as the therapist, needed information. I needed to know, have you been drinking this week? How much have you been drinking this week? How did that affect you this week? What impact did that have on your family? That's very directive and very probing, which is kind of contradicts what we've just said from the person-centered model, because it was 100% for my frame of reference. But there was a need to know from a risk evaluation perspective. And I think as soon as it comes to hidden risk or when we're looking at risk, there are times where we'll need to ask directive questions.
Well, here we go, Ken, because what's happening is that when you're assessing risk, you're stepping out of the modality.
Yeah.
What you're doing is you're doing a different piece of work. And, so somebody might come to you and say, I'm thinking of taking my own life. Good practice would be to ask them, do they have a plan? And if they say no, and you may then say, have you ever attempted to take your own life before? And they say no. You can pretty much say that there's no plan in place and the risk is lower. There's not no risk, but it's lower than you ask the same question to a client and they say, yes, I've got a plan. I've got some pills that I'm going to take when I get home, and I've attempted suicide. I've attempted to take my own life before. That ramps the risk up. So there are certain times where we have to use questions, and you know what I think this is. I think this is being part of a contemporary clinical practice. I think in the times when person-centered therapy was invented and evolving, it was a different era. It was a completely different era. And I just don't think they had that kind of mindset in place. We now have, we're now accountable for our clinical work. So sometimes we have to step out of the modality we're in to be able to assess and manage risk.
Definitely. So where risk is concerned, questions, the appropriateness of questions would change. And then I guess there's thinking that suggests that when we are working at depth with a client, and I think it was just last podcast when we were speaking about relational depth and what that is. So if you're interested in that, Counseling Tutor, that's our website. Go to the podcast tab. Today's episode is 214. And if you go to last week, that was 213, and you'll see all about relational depth there. When we are at depth with a client, when the client is in the process, they're in the zone, as it were, where they're right in the emotions of what they're presenting. They're refeeling it and bringing it into the here and now. They're using emotional words. When we ask a question, it can take the person away from that feeling into a thinking. It can move from I'm feeling to a cognitive process. Oh, hold on, let me think about that. And it can pull somebody out of the depth of the emotion of the presentation. So that's one of the things we need to be mindful of if we are using any kind of questions. And the questions that for me which are inappropriate are things like, have you tried, insert whatever you like here, have you thought about blah, 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 have they ever, could you not have? Those are the kind of questions that don't serve other than to get the person to think about something and come away from the emotion that they're experiencing at that moment. And we're not there to rescue, specifically not if you're working from a person-centered model. You're not there to rescue. So we're not there to say, have you tried?
Yes, absolutely, Ken. And I think we talked a lot about person-centered therapy. Yep. And we have to acknowledge there's other therapies. And certainly in cognitive behavioral therapy, there's a tradition of what's called Socratic questions, which I believe comes from the philosopher Socrates, who basically said, I know nothing. He said, I know nothing. And the way I find out is by asking questions. And I think, interestingly, we in CBT, it's a deliberate questioning strategy is built into it. And one of the reasons is that with Socratic questioning, there is an amount of discomfort in the response to the question, because as you say, Ken, when you said to your client when you worked in alcohol services, how much you've been drinking this week, that brings forward to the mind of the person exactly how much they've had to drink.
Yeah.
And it brings it into sharp relief. And I'm sure that when you ask that question for the right reasons, there was an amount of discomfort there as people are faced with the reality of what's going on for them. And in certain treatment pathways, it's only when people grasp the reality that they can make changes. So, I think we have to be thoughtful that questioning itself is fairly benign. It's how it's applied within the modality. And CBT is all about changing our thoughts. It's basically classic CBT. I know there's third wave CBT that integrates the emotional aspects. And I know a lot of CBT therapists would work on an emotional level. They're not interrogators. But it does go to prove, doesn't it, that just the skill, just using questioning is so different within two specific modalities.
Yes. And of course, there are other modalities that are question based, and it's about the appropriateness of that. If you're practicing within those modalities, you will be asking those questions for a very specific reason linked to theory that underpins why those questions are important. And I think that's the importance here, and it's about what is your training, and what is the reason for the question. And we're not the experts at all.
No.
We're two colleagues. We're here discussing it, having a chat about topics that interest us, things that come up on our Facebook group. And we encourage you to ask these questions about questioning to yourself as well. What does questioning mean for you? Do you find that there are certain questions that might be quite directive that are effective? I don't know. Have the conversations. It's definitely a topic worth thinking about. And if you want to delve a little deeper, Rory has created what we call the Super Duper handout. I always call your handout Super Duper, Rory.
Well, thank you very much.
I was reading over
they are
it.
Super Duper.
They're so concise. Rory has a special skill of taking lots of theory and just condensing it down into just the stuff you really need. And the handout is called Appropriate Use of Questions. It's available free of charge from counselingtutor.com. Click on the podcasts tab, go to today's episode 214. There it is in the page. You can download Appropriate Use of Questions handout. Maybe use it with your peers if you're training. Stimulate a conversation about questioning.
Absolutely. And talking about peers, you've alluded to, of course, our Facebook page. If you want to join our Facebook community, if you go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, you'll find us. We're a closed group. Knock on the door and our caring, lovely moderation team will let you in and join the party with hundreds and thousands of like-minded people, students. There are qualified colleagues, supervisors, and also a lot of counselling lecturers in there, all talking about the world of counselling and psychotherapy. So pop yourself in there, and why don't you ask some questions in the group? You see what I did there?
I do. I tell you, this is like a laugh a minute, Rory. Well, it is for me and you anyway.
It is.
So moving away from our counselling foundations and that appropriate use of questions, we now go into focus on self, where we recognise you as the practitioner. You are the heartbeat of your practice. And we kind of try to look at something that we may come across in practice that has an influence on us. And I think it's a great topic that you've chosen today, Rory. And, speaking about the Facebook group, I know this is, again, a question that comes up in the Facebook group again and again. So definitely go and join that. And the question is around, you're in practice, a client comes in, we're sometimes dealing with some pretty heavy emotional material. The client leaves, and a couple of hours later, you still got that story, that narrative, that client's material banging around in your head. It's almost like it didn't leave with them, Rory. And this is the topic about leaving client material behind.
And it's interesting. When I picked this topic, I was transferred back to a warm September afternoon in 1999, where I was sat in my introduction group. And this question came up. We're all doing the introduction to counselling. It was at the time I did it, it was a 6-week course. It's a 10-week course now. And I remember this being brought up, and our tutor, Annie, she said, what I do is at the end of a session, I take all the negative emotions that are in the room, all the hurt and the pain, and I imagine a waste paper basket, and I put all that in the waste paper basket. I cram it in, and then I physically get up, walk towards the invisible paper basket, turn it upside down and empty it. But it does speak to the fact that we are human and we are vulnerable to being breached. I call it being breached. I can remember many years ago when I was a school counsellor, and I had a client and they told me a story. And as they're telling me, I thought, I'm breached. I'm breached. I want to take this client home. Come and live with me. come and live with me. And I really, through the session, I really, really had to bracket myself to stay into the frame of reference. And I can remember when the client left, I just gave a big sign. I went for a walk around the school. And here's the thing, Ken, it wouldn't go away. This client permeated my waking thoughts and my dreaming sleep. And eventually I had to have an early supervision to walk me out of it. And I fear if I hadn't have done, I may have become quite unwell because I just couldn't get it out. I just couldn't get it out of my mind. Not the client's fault. It was just that it had breached my emotional boundary, which is unusual for me because I'm fairly robust, I think. And it was really interesting. What came from it was really interesting. The supervisionary encounter was really, really profound for me. And it also drove home the element of transference, which is so important. It wasn't about the clients. It was about me.
Yeah, as you were kind of relating how that impacted on you, the first thing that came to mind for me was transferential, and I guess this is a really interesting topic, and it's interesting because as caring professionals, we go into being a caring professional because we want to make a difference, because we really care about the person who's in front of us. We really care about the material they're bringing. And we're part of that material with them. It's a relationship. We're embroiled in it as they bring it. And we're called on to do that, to be with them as if seeing it like they're seeing it. And then when the client leaves, it's it's almost unthinkable that we would have a magic switch that we would go, we could take really heavy emotional material and go, click, okay, well, there we go. Moving on. What's next? Next. Yes. In the same way as you might watch a film or a documentary or something that may move you, it may stick around with you a little bit afterwards. And I think it's important to have methods of dissipating that. Now, there's going to be times when it doesn't dissipate, and that's you've given an example of that, Rory, which would lead you to need to take further action, which we'll discuss in a moment. Rory, you mentioned supervision, but I really liked how you started with your first trainer from your concepts in counseling training, Rory, where there was a description of going through a thought process when a client leaves, of taking the material, the negatives or whatever it is, and putting it somewhere. And that may seem ritualistic, but I understand what's behind that. There is a process of, I'm putting this aside now. It's not mine. This is not my stuff. I share that journey with the client, but it's not my stuff. And as the client leaves, I can put it one side. I can lock it away or put it in that waste paper basket and get rid of that. And it's whatever works for you. It may be writing your notes, your client notes works for you, because it's a way of getting it out of you and putting it down on paper. I've spoken to people, a number of people who've said that they don't type their notes. They need to handwrite them. There's a cathartic process in getting that information out in handwriting it. Of course, journaling is a great place where we can get those thoughts and emotions out from with us. And it may be natural for something to linger just for a little while, but as soon as it starts sticking around, as soon as it's present in a different client's journey, you've got another client in the room and your head is still with another client, or many hours, maybe a day after the client has gone, it is still with you. That is an indication to take it further. And you mentioned supervision, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have the 48-hour rule, which we used to teach. If it's still rattling around in your mind after 40 hours, speak with your supervisor. But I also think it speaks to something else, and it's a bit of an inconvenient truth, I think, in our profession, is that you have to be reasonably emotionally robust to do the work we do.
Yep.
And to get to emotional robustness, is one of the reasons why we're asked to undertake our own personal therapy while we train. And I think it's about being very, very realistic. Are there certain presentations that could give you a difficulty? And I can give you an account of someone I knew who was a very, very competent, very put together person who ended up being sectioned under the Mental Health Act. And it turned out that they'd sat in front of someone who talked about a certain issue that had impacted them in the past, and it completely buttled them to the point where they're at one point under a compulsory section. Now, I don't want to scare people here. The chances of that are very few and far between, but it does speak to thinking about what clients you're working with. You know, having a mixed client load is very, very useful for our own mental and emotional well-being. I think if we're seeing one intense, and I use the word respectfully, heavy-duty client after another, there's going to be an accounting for that, and we need to be very, very, very thoughtful. But you're absolutely right. Some way of being able to release that energy, and I think there's no better way than process notes, where you're writing your own personal journal and your own feelings to get it onto paper. If you're like me and you don't write too well, why don't you record it? You know, I find that very cathartic. I'll sit with my microphone and I'll just record my feelings, and then maybe 24 hours later I'll just put the earphones on again and play them back and be able to see the difference now from then. But you definitely need a strategy to look after yourself in this work.
Yeah. And that recognition of when this needs taking to another level into, and supervision is going to be your place to take that in.
Yeah.
And I think about it as like drinking something cold. You know, you can drink something cold and maybe your teeth might ache a little bit afterwards, like, you know, just for a few minutes. I'm speaking about myself here. That's very different to if you drink something and suddenly it kind of almost sends you through the roof. And that would indicate there's a hole in your tooth that's different to the cold just affecting the teeth. And the same is true here. You know, we can take on and carry maybe a little bit of a remnant, a little bit of dust from a presentation. But there are other times when our own maybe subconscious processes will be triggered. It's that hole in the tooth. And that's what happened to you, Rory, when you were saying this person, within the session, you were already in I want to take this person home with me and look after them. I want to nurture and care. I want to rescue this person already. And I'm sure that in that moment, alarm bells were going off where you were going, what? What's going on here then?
It was one phrase, and I won't mention the phrase. It was one phrase that this person, and even thinking about it now, I can still feel the emotion rising in me.
Yes.
And it was just one. It was at the end of the session, and the client was summing up where they're at, and they used one phrase innocently threw a phrase in, and I just thought, that's it, I've gone.
Yes. Now, when you say that emotion, that you could feel the emotions rise up in you, looking back on this now, whose emotions were those that were rising up in you?
Well, as I work through in supervision, I'm a father. I'm now a grandfather. I was a father at the time. They were my fatherly emotions. I wanted to give the same care to this client as I gave to my daughter, and it was a very confusing. And to be honest, Ken, for a short time, I felt a little bit ashamed. I was lecturing counselling, and I was going around with the wrong-headed view of, well, I should know about this kind of stuff. I'm always saying this to students. Very different telling a dry theory to actually experiencing it, and actually having experienced it, it was really useful then to share the general idea with students. And they said, well, I'm not on my own. And indeed with other practitioners, I'm not on my own. It's not weird to think like that. Of course it's not. You're human, you care. That's going to happen.
Yeah. And kind of just full circling it now, that question I asked you of whose emotions was it that was arising, you've kind of owned them. They were your 100% your emotions, not the client's. And when it is the client stuff that stays with us for a little while, it will dissipate. It will go away because it's theirs, and we've just held it. We've just held our hands out to hold it just for a few moments. But when it sticks around, it's not their stuff. It's ours. We may taint it with their story and project onto them the feelings we're feeling, but it's usually our stuff that's been triggered. good supervision is going to get to the root of that. It's going to identify that hole in the tooth that's caused you to jump out of your seat when the nerve is twitched, and hopefully start working on filling that out. And I'm glad you shared that, Rory, and I'm sure you're a richer therapist for it, a better supervisor for it, for experiencing it yourself. You know, we hear about these topics, and but they're real. They happen. They happen. And it's about when they do, what do we do? So there we are. There we have it. That's Focus on Self, leaving client material behind.
Yes, indeed. And as we leave that client material behind, we move to Practice Matters. And of course, the interview with James Taylor on social media etiquette. Social media is, in fact, in all our lives, it permeates everything. Tweet, Facebook, the myriad of different platforms that people can express themselves on. And in fact, sometimes we get kind of overwhelmed with it, and we may tweet or say things that we get later. James Taylor has given a great lecture for our Counsellor CSR library and the CPD library on social media etiquette. And I caught up with him to ask him, what are the things we have to be thoughtful of? And this is what he had to say.
Practice Matters.
And we welcome James Taylor, who is one of our Facebook moderators, keeping our Facebook page safe and respectful and informative. So, James, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Rory. Thanks for inviting me.
It's a pleasure, and I'm sure there's lots of people who know you from your Top Tips Tuesday on our Facebook page, and you're a very vibrant contributor to Facebook. And today we're talking about being respectful on social media, and I think we've all seen social media posts on different sites where we've taken a deep intake of breath sometimes. And my question to you is why is it, as therapists, we need to think and be respectful on social media?
I think that's a fantastic question. And I think the answer is potentially huge. We are potentially looked at not as people. We are potentially looked at as therapists, and only therapists, and we don't have any sort of form of views on life outside the room. A bit like when you go to the dentist. You don't think the dentist does anything else apart from being a dentist. Well, with social media, if people know this about us and we are not so careful with how we phrase things before we press post, not only can it cause upset to somebody else, but it can cause a ripple in the waters about our profession in general. And even if you delete it, someone could have screenshotted the comment, so it's there forevermore. So it has huge repercussions, not for yourself, not only for yourself, for your practice, for your membership, for the community as a whole. So I always think it's a good idea just to have another reread before you press post. Yes,
I think that's true. And I think that social media, depending on what social media platform you use, it's so accessible. You could access it from your mobile phone, your computer, even your TV in some cases. And I'll taking up the point of the fact that, when we post as therapists, we're actually to some extent representing the profession.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And that kind of puts it in a different light. We're not really posting as ourselves, we're posting in terms of the profession. And I guess sometimes that immediacy can lead us down the rabbit hole of maybe posting questions about clients. I know that one of the things we were very careful of in on our Facebook page, the Counselling Tutor Facebook page, is helping those who are members not to post information that could identify their clients.
Yeah, that's a huge no-no. It's good to ask questions for clarification. Has anyone got any advice over reading material for anxiety? Anyone can suggest any courses for this or for that, but to script a question in a way where anyone can identify anyone is a huge no-no.
Yeah. And what are the other dangers of asking questions about client presentation on a social media page?
Well, you can't control what some of the answers might be that come in from some of the other people or some of the replies, or not counselling tutor at all, but elsewhere you get the trolls, you get these kind of unkind comments coming in from a whole variety of different sources. So it can really escalate quite quick.
Yeah, absolutely. And also there's the veracity of the information that's supplied. When you're posting on a social media page, you don't really know who's answering you, do you?
No, you're potentially, and it's dependent on how big your social media presence is, you can potentially be in view of thousands and thousands, if not more, people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we got 50,000 or more at the time, many thousands of people on our Facebook page. And when the danger of asking certainly clinical questions is quite dangerous. What would your view be on the dangers of taking the responses from a clinical question asked about a client and putting them into practice, having got them off a Facebook page?
I think there's a few dangers. I think, you're only getting a snapshot, maybe a paragraph of information and running with it. And I think it's dangerous to try and apply a paragraph of information with a human being you're working with. I think that's a big one. Also, as well, you don't know in what context that information has come up from. If it's accurate, is it just the person's perception who was posting it? Is it accurate? Is there an agenda? I think sometimes I prefer to be on more firmer footing, really, myself.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I've always said that if you've got a pressing question about a client, it may be best to press the speed dial on your phone and speak to your supervisor rather 100%. than pressing Facebook. But we're so used to it. I was asking questions about how to level a washing machine on a Facebook group the other day. And it was, I'll ask on Facebook, I've got this immediate problem. My washing machine is rattling away like it's going to explode, and it needed leveling, and I had to ask a question. And I guess that sometimes therapists come out of a session, they've got something on their mind, and we're so used to this kind of an instant answer on our phone that we may ask a question not realizing the ramifications.
Absolutely. I mean, I think if people were as simple as washing machines, our profession wouldn't exist. But people are a little bit more articulate than that, so need the proper care, really.
Yes, I mean, the answer to my question was get yourself a spanner, a 17 millimeter spanner.
And that worked.
And that worked. But it is a little bit. You're absolutely right. People are more complex and it's more nuanced. I think. In terms of the kind of posts that as a moderator you may remove, or I know that you write to posters, what are the kind of themes that come up where you might have to write to a poster and say, can you just kind of moderate what you're doing?
It can be a few things. It can sometimes be, I've got this client who is suffering with, let me just think off the top of my head. So they might say, I've got this client who's having a relationship problem with the husband, and any ideas of how they can have couple counselling. Well, that's a complete no-no, because not only are you disclosing what the client's saying to you, you're disclosing about the client's husband. Yes. So it's just a huge. So that's one type of thing. Another one could be if someone's talking about a family member of themselves. So it could be something along the lines of, my son has ADHD. Does anyone have any advice? Well, the son may not want the fact that they've got ADHD be put on a social media site with almost 50,000 members being aware of it. And as moderators, we don't know if the son is okay with it, if you've given permission, if that should be out there in the first place. So to err on the side of caution, we have to then contact a member and say, can you reword that? Anyone advice around, or anyone have any good information or read material for regarding ADHD? So if he word it a certain way, and sometimes it can just be a few words, And the whole post is now okay compared to being not okay.
Yeah. So I post saying, any advice about any advice about a teen with ADHD or resources for a teen with ADHD.
Yeah.
Is a general question that couldn't be kind of attributed to any individual person. Yeah. And I think it's really interesting because I think sometimes we don't realise just how accessible we are on social media. So, I've got a very unusual name. We were talking about it before we hit the record button. Rory Lees Oakes is a very unique name. And I know from the analytics software that we use, and anyone can use, that I get lots of searches. In fact, one of them is Rory Lees Oakes married. And the answer to that question is yes, I am. So, we know that.
I can hear hearts breaking all over the country as you're saying that, Ronnie.
I think not. I think not. We'll move on. And I think that we know that sometimes clients may search for their therapists. When I first started in counselling, social media didn't exist. I sound like a dinosaur. Very few people had the internet and only a few people had a mobile phone. And I'm talking 1999. It's not that long ago. Nowadays, you can literally find everything about anybody. And I think that, clients will search for their therapist, won't they?
Yeah, they will be. And it's not done out of malice in any way. It might just be, I just want to check this person out. I want to see what they're interested in. I want to see a picture of them. If their profile presence doesn't have a profile picture, you might go searching for one. Well, you've got quite a unique name. I've got quite a common name because mine's James Taylor.
Yeah.
So what comes up when people search for me is normally the American singer.
Yes.
But I think it's important. I was speaking about this on one of the videos that I did for Counselling Tutor, on one of the little Top Tip Tuesdays that I did about your social media presence. And I think the example I gave was, if you had a Facebook profile, for instance, and you only use that to post the pictures of when you're out with friends in the pub having a drink, and you don't use it for nothing else. And if that Facebook profile is quite open, if a client were to find you, they may think you've got a drinking problem.
Yes.
But that's only a snapshot of your life.
Yes.
So, but clients they're trying to bond. I think they're trying to, make a connection somewhere.
Yes. And also, of course, one could argue that having a strong kind of political beliefs could impact, on your Facebook, on social media, could impact on the therapeutic relationship. It may be that, a client looks you up and doesn't particularly like your politic for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that, anyone can take umbrage to anything, really.
Yes.
But it's just being aware of what's on your own social media presence, I'd suggest. And lock down your profile so only your friends can see. Only the people you actually know can see what's on your stuff.
The point I'm coming to is that we could be searched and people could form a view via very little piece of information. The final question I wanted to ask you, it's one that comes up a lot, and we hear it not just in social media, but in general society, is the aspect of free speech. I should be entitled to say anything I want at any time I want, and I shouldn't be audited for that. And I think that's a particular tricky one where we look at Facebook pages, because some people have very strong views on things. Yes. And in communities, that could cause some difficulty, can't it?
It can. I mean, it's. I agree that we should be able to say what's on our mind, and ideally, be delivered with kindness.
Yes.
And I think sometimes it's the last bit that's missing.
Yes. Yeah. So the idea that we should have free speech, but we need to think about the impact our free speech may have.
Yeah, I mean, I would truly be mortified if I posted something and I inadvertently offended someone else. But a bit of one of the Top Tip Tuesdays that I've done, it's about controlling what you can and don't try and control what you can't. So you can't control what you post. You can't control what your profile settings are. You can't decide to press the post button or do it a letter beforehand. What you can't control is how everyone else is going to perceive it. But I think if you're coming at it from a good, honest intent, I think you're halfway there.
Yeah, and I think that's it. I think if people can see that your intentions are correct, people may still choose to take offence or choose to challenge, but I think if it comes from a place of genuine concern, there lies the heart of a debate. But sometimes debate on Facebook isn't particularly productive because people write, and sometimes that's not the best way they communicate.
I think one of the problems as well is there's no tonality in the written text. Me and you are having a conversation now. I can pick up inflections in your voice if I'm being asked a question. On a written text, it's just so you're getting a snapshot of a snapshot.
Yes.
So it's easy to get the wrong end of the stick.
Yes, absolutely. And then, of course, sometimes we get disinhibition effect where people feel they can say something and type in because they're not in front of the person. It's the old thing. Would you type what you're going to say? The context of it, would you actually say it if you're stood in front of somebody? And that's my litmus test nowadays.
It is, and it's a good one to have. One of the common phrases for it is a bit of a keyboard warrior, this kind of stuff. But yeah, that's a huge thing, and I haven't really figured out why that's more acceptable to do that, and then press post. And not give a damn about the implications of what you're saying, or not caring about anyone else's feelings at all. Yeah. As far as I'm aware, the amount of people's opinions who've been changed by being abused on a social media or post are quite low. Yes.
Shouting on social media probably doesn't change opinions, And there's a wonderful philosophical statement by Rumi, who was a Sufi scholar, I believe, who said, "Between right and wrong there's a garden, I'll meet you there. In between right and wrong there's a garden, and I'll meet you there."
I like that, and I'm stealing
it. My gift to you. And I think that sometimes debating really important issues across Facebook pages really isn't useful. I think it's the one thing that Freud and Jung taught us, that they fell out terribly because they wrote letters to each other.
Yeah.
It's
funny. I remember it reminded me as you were saying that, and this is more perhaps for an older generation than a younger generation who may be listening to this. When I got my father on, my father's passed away now, but I got him on Facebook when he was in his 70s. And he was overjoyed because he was posting on Facebook, didn't really know how to use it. And all the grandkids were like, wow, granddad's on Facebook. But what he was doing was, and he didn't know the significance of this, he had the caps lock on his computer. So he was posting in capitals for everything without realizing in the terminology that's classed as shouting. So that's something to be aware of as well. If you're typing a genuine message out and your caps lock is on, and you don't realize the significance, someone else can, again, because it's a snapshot of a snapshot, they can think, why are you shouting at me?
Yeah.
or even if your reply was, yes, I understand, because you genuinely do understand, they could take it as you're being sarcastic with me.
Yeah.
Because you're shouting at me on text.
You're absolutely right. It's the nuance, isn't it? It's the nuance is sometimes lost. And I have to admit that I have sometimes written things. I have dyslexia, and my communication by text is very difficult for me. I kind of bang the keyboard, make sure the spelling's right, and press send. And sometimes I think I wouldn't have said it like that, but I've written it in a different way. Which is why anybody who emails me about questions, I usually make them a video, because I struggle with context in writing because I just can't do it. And I think it's a lesson for us all. If there was one takeaway from using Facebook or social media that you wanted to share with the listener, to live a kind of more fruitful and kind of more collegiate life in terms of, working with colleagues and working across social media, what would it be?
It would be it'd be coming out from two ways. I come out from what you're doing and what others are doing. So the first one would be with what you're doing. I would say reread before you press post, and then just before you press post, reread it again, just to make sure, and try and see it from an impartial point of view. And I would say from an external thing coming in, you can't control what's coming in unless you're blocking someone. But know that it's just a snapshot of a snapshot. And if you keep from a good place at your end, if the other person agrees or disagrees, that's them. But if you do the best you can do at your end to look after yourself and this profession and be ethical, I think you're going the right way.
Yeah, which kind of echoes what we do in our practice lives. So on those wise words, James, thank you for joining us.
Big thank you to James Taylor for that information. Thank you to you, Rory, for hosting that interview and for sharing that information with us. Really important information. And I think it's also just worth doing a special mention for Charlie Naj, who is our main moderator in our social media platform. That's the Facebook group for Counselling Tutor, who was instrumental in writing this lecture. It was actually written by Charlie Naj, and it was, of course, delivered beautifully by James Taylor. And if you're interested in seeing that lecture, you can do so by going to our Counsellor CPD library, if you are a member, or if you're a student, that lecture is also available in the Counselling Study Resource Library as well. If you're not a member of either of those, you can get more information at counsellingtutor.com on how to become a member, and you can have a look and see if that would be a fit for you.
Well, that wraps up this podcast. We started off with counselling foundations and the skill of questioning. We looked at focus on self, leaving client material behind and making sure that we are emotionally well and can be engaged with our lives after we've listened and been involved in other people's lives. And finally, that wonderful interview with James Taylor on social media etiquette wraps us up. And as always, stay grounded and please stay safe.
If you're a qualified counsellor or psychotherapist, then why not check out the Counsellor CPD Library? Stay current with your CPD requirements with over 150 hours of academically rigorous, on-demand lectures you can stream to your device. Joining Counsellor CPD will expand your skill set to create a more specialised, highly rewarding practice. For more information on the Counsellor CPD Library, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.